going to get started again. My name is Salima Hankins. I'm the Deputy Director of the U.S. Human Rights Network and one of the co-conveners of this event. What we're going to do right now is actually play a special message from Tendai Achiume, who is the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. She apologizes for not being able to be here, but she wanted to record a special message for us. So I'm going to go ahead and play that now.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tendai Achiume. I'm a professor of law at UCLA School of Law, and I'm also the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. Let me begin first by congratulating the U.S. Human Rights Network, the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, and the Leadership Conference and Education Fund, as well as the European Network on People of African Descent for putting together such an important event. And I want to congratulate you also on convening such a powerful and inspiring group of people. I sincerely regret not being able to physically be present to learn from you all and to benefit from the powerful energy that I have no doubt you're generating together. I have to prepare for a country mission, and it wasn't possible for me to rearrange the visit so that I could attend the summit. The decade is, among other things, an important opportunity for movement building across borders and also for pushing for the fulfillment of commitments made in the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action to guarantee the rights of all persons, regardless of race or ethnicity. In part to commemorate the decade, I focused my last thematic report to the General Assembly on reparations for racial discrimination rooted in colonialism and slavery, including, of course, for people of African descent. And in the short time that I have with you, I wanted to share with you some of the analysis of my report, which I encourage you to read. It's available on the website. Reparations for slavery and colonialism concern not only justice and accountability for historic wrongs, but also the eradication of persisting structures of racial inequality and discrimination that have resulted from the failure to address racism for slavery and colonialism. And so reparations are about accountability for individual and collective wrongful acts. But beyond that, the project of reparations is about reforming entire legal, economic, social, and political structures that slavery and colonialism enabled, and that, as the Durban Declaration notes, continue to sustain racial discrimination and inequality today. Too often political debates about reparations for racial injustice begin from the premise that reparations are inherently exceptional or an unusual remedy. But reparations as holistic and effective remedies for those who've suffered a wrongful act are far from novel, and rather states actually routinely provide reparations for wrongful acts and violations to one another and to their own citizens. Reparations are a fundamental element both of international law and international human rights law and international practices, tribunal decisions, and other sources of international law that have long held that state breaches for legal obligations entail responsibility to provide for reparations. The obligation to provide for reparations is also fully entrenched in international human rights law, including in Article 6 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. If reparations are an available and established remedy for human rights violations, why do reparations for racial discrimination rooted in slavery and colonialism remain both elusive and polarizing among UN member states? In the report, I highlight that the legal and political opposition to reparations, opposition which has established, I would say, a pattern of racial discrimination in the allocation of reparations, is actually quite striking. For example, to date, the people who have benefited the most from reparations related to the end of slavery have been perpetrators and their descendants. So that is, slaveholding families and their descendants are the ones who benefited most from reparations. And then descendants of people who were enslaved and treated as property, on the other hand, remain unheard and in some cases even vilified for seeking relief from racial injustice. A serious barrier to reparations remains ignorance and lack of awareness among the public and even among national leaders regarding the persisting racially discriminatory legacies of slavery and colonialism. In many countries, I've found that educational curricula contain partial histories that erase the fundamental role that enslavement and colonial domination played in securing the past and present prosperity of enslaving and colonial powers. These histories may sometimes refer to the brutalities of colonialism and slavery, but very rarely do they make explicit the public and private beneficiaries of slavery and colonialism and the persisting racial legacies of colonialism and slavery. State opposition to reparations cannot be attributed to a lack of necessary technical knowledge, and numerous states and communities have mobilized the requisite political will, mobilization, and creativity to ensure effective reparations. To carry out reparations, states could rely, for example, on the experience and knowledge of those who have designed and administered and received reparations for acts carried out by Nazi Germany, for British violations against the Mau Mau of Kenya, for violations by the Canadian government against Indigenous peoples who were subjected to the residential schools program, and I highlight these examples in the report as well. My report ultimately concludes that the firmest state resistance to reparations arises from a lack of political will and genuine commitment to undoing the legacies of slavery and colonialism, especially from those states who benefited the most from both. Frequently, states point to doctrines in international law that they interpret as presenting barriers to legal accountability for slavery and colonialism, and I address these concerns in my report, noting that legal formalism obscures the full potential of existing international law to support reparations for the injustices of colonialism and slavery. In other words, it's possible to do far more with the existing law. It's also worth pointing out that international legal doctrine has a longer history of justifying and enabling colonial domination than it does guaranteeing equal rights to all human beings. Law that perpetuates neo-colonial dynamics, including the failure to eradicate slavery, the legacies of slavery and colonialism, but it must itself be recognized and condemned as neo-colonial law. And the impetus should be to develop legal doctrines that ensure justice and equality for all, irrespective of race. And so to the extent that UN member states confront legal barriers to reparations, they have an obligation to exercise their legal powers to prioritize and ensure the decolonization of international law. Slavery and colonialism were global projects, and reparations for both require global intervention and transnational solidarity. And one of my commitments as Special Rapporteur is to continue to use my thematic reports and country visits to join all of you in putting pressure on UN member states to take this decade seriously. Again, I'm sad not to be able to join you in person, but congratulations again to the organizers for making this important gathering a reality.
Thank you, thank you. Will the panelists please approach the stage so we can begin our panel on reparatory justice? After those wonderful comments by our Special Rapporteur, I think we have a great deal of food for thought, and it will only be further enhanced by our excellent panelists here, one of whom is coming to the stage now. That was great. And actually, this will be the first panelist that I want to introduce. So Nkechi Taifa, is the founder and CEO of the Taifa Group, co-founder of N'COBRA, which is one of the longtime organizations fighting for reparations here in the United States. She convenes and directs the Justice Roundtable, which is an advocacy coalition advancing progressive justice system reform, and she serves as a senior fellow for the Center for Justice at Columbia University in New York. Next to her is Chevy Eugene, United Nations People of African Descent Fellow, who has also begun a special research project on reparations, which is something I'm sure we'll be hearing a great deal about over the course of his presentation. Next to Chevy is Esther Ojulari, who is another scholar on the issue of reparations. She is part of the collective, she works on specifically collective reparations in Colombia and is currently pursuing her PhD on the subject at the University of London. And finally, we have Krista Noel from Women's All Points Bulletin USA, a longtime scholar and organizer who has specifically worked on reparations initiatives in Chicago, successful reparations initiatives in Chicago that have brought about justice for those who were victims of police violence in that city. So let's give this panel a round of applause. They're doing a lot of great analysis. And I was just going to let you start off with any thoughts you might have on, or responses to the Special Rapporteur's comments, I guess, beginning on the question of reparations based on your particular experience. Where are we now on the issue, and what sorts of questions are you most interested in addressing as we move forward? So we can start with Nkechi.
Okay, well, thank you so very much, Professor Justin Hansen. And I just want to start out by giving a shout out to Dr. Ackland Lynch, who was there in the audience. And I wanted to do that because he was one of, if you can just raise your hand, Dr. Ackland Lynch, he was one of the first people, one of my first mentors way back in the late 70s when I was a student. He and Dr. Ron Walters would do these lectures, and it really sensitized me to issues on the world stage. I just wanted to, well, I dropped the mic on that. I just wanted to say thank you very much for your longstanding contributions. So what I want to, yes. So what I want to address is the issue, because it came up a little bit earlier in terms of government, and specifically the United States government. I just want to, I know we know who's in the presidency now and all like that, but I just want to make sure that it's clear to everybody just why it is that we do call for reparations, reparatory justice from government. I'm speaking specifically of the United States government. And in so doing, I want to make sure that we all remember the origins of the Black nation here in the United States. We are the descendants of Africans kidnapped and transported to the United States with every single arm of the United States law enforcing and lawmaking machinery, whether we're talking about U.S. federal law, state law, high court decisions, or lower court decisions to do dehumanization, the genocidal atrocities, the terrorism of the enslavement, of our enslavement in the United States. They were not isolated incidences or occurrences, but they were a matter of war. War conducted under the specific authority of the United States Constitution. The kidnapping was a wrongful act for which our ancestors and we as their heirs are entitled to damages. The enslavement was a wrongful act for which our ancestors and we as their heirs are entitled to damages. The stealing of our labor was a wrongful act, as was the physical and mental and cultural genocide that we are still suffering. We are entitled to damages, to reparations, to reparatory justice. The compensations we speak of are owed to us. If we want to just take a quick look at U.S. Constitutional Article 1, Clause 1, Section 9, it expressly sanctioned and guaranteed the continued importation of kidnapped African prisoners of war to every single state that might desire our free labor until the year 1808. And that article further upheld the further dehumanization of the African by relegating our status to that of 3/5 of a white man. And most egregious, it was war conducted against the African on this soil under the authority of yet another constitutional provision, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, known as the Fugitive Slave Provision, which mandated that no enslaved person, even if he or she had reached a free state, none of it was safe. None of us was safe. And it was the constitutional duty, the obligation of every single white man, woman, or child to deliver us up to the government. You see, this is really why reparatory justice is so important. Every time we ran away, it didn't matter if we just walked off quietly in the night, Harriet Tubman. It didn't matter if we initiated elaborate slave insurrections, Demar Vesey. It didn't matter if we fled to Pennsylvania or New York. They were going to come after us. There was nowhere that was safe. Wasn't going to be no 500 years of Palmares liberation, Marcos wherever he is, no Ganga Zumbi here in this country. Okay, they were going to come after us with their armed forces and with their paddy rollers, with their militia and their dogs. So you might ask, well, what about the 13th Amendment passed in 1865, recognized the freedom of all enslaved Africans, made it illegal to continue slavery except for that punishment for a crime clause. No payment, however, was made for the stolen labor, for the physical and cultural rape and economic exploitation. In fact, the Dred Scott case had been decided scarcely 8 years prior, in which a Supreme Court justice ruled that a black person in America had no rights which a white person was bound to respect, and that neither Dred Scott nor any other black person could be a citizen of the United States in the manner in which that word was used in the Constitution. You see, when they wrote the preamble to the Constitution, we the people, they meant we the white people. And it is not just the enslavement era. Reparations are owed for what happened after enslavement and what is still happening today. Whether we're speaking of the convict leasing system, the Jim Crow laws, the lynchings, the housing exclusion through redlining, the racial application of the death penalty, mass incarceration disproportionately impacting black people, all of those, okay, are measures that must be redressed. So when we see that video of the ruthless pursuit, chasing down and blatant gunning down of Walter Scott in South Carolina like a runaway slave. This was just a couple of years ago. When we see the gunning down of Michael Brown, okay, in Ferguson like a dog in the street. When we see Eric Garner in New York being choked to death, and all the countless others, every week there's a new hashtag. We know that there is a connection between the United States criminal punishment system and the necessity for reparatory justice. When we know about the merciless experimentation on defensive black women devoid of anesthesia, which led to the modern day gynecology, we know that there's a connection between the disparities in the healthcare system and the necessity for reparatory justice. When we see the enormous profits from slavery made by corporations and insurance companies and banking and investment industries, etc., we know that there's a connection between the lack of economic opportunity and the necessity for reparatory justice. When we see that prison beds are constructed on the test scores of black boys in the 3rd grade, we know that there is a connection between the educational system and the need for reparatory justice. There is a connection between post-traumatic slavery syndrome and post-incarceration stress syndrome and the necessity for the reparatory justice. There is a connection. And each and every harm must be compensated, and it is past time that the role of the federal government be pushed out and acknowledged through the passage of H.R. 40. And with respect to reparatory justice, it's not just the federal government, but also state governments, corporations, and industries, academic institutions, religious orders, and yes, comparable private estates who benefited directly, and there's so many others who blatantly benefited indirectly. The roles of all of these entities must be pulled out from under the rug and addressed with redress. And then the last point I want to make is that there has been, as we've stated repeatedly, a lack of outcry from government about the decade and its importance. No media attention, no partnering, no resources. And if you juxtapose this nothingness, okay, from the U.S. government, from what happened vis-a-vis the UN decade that just preceded this one, which was the decade of Roma inclusion, you would see that there's a disparity there. I won't even get into who the Roma is and all like that. Most folks from Europe know, but folk here in the United States might not. We can discuss that later. But we saw an unprecedented collaboration between 12 European countries, encouraged by the World Bank, and yes, the Open Society Foundations, where I used to work. Other partners included the United Nations Development Program, the Council of Europe, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, various Roma organizations. The decade for Roma inclusion also benefited from the support of the European Commission, and the list goes on and on and on. That's not to say that what ultimately happened at the end, Justin, of that decade was totally successful, but what it did show was a commitment on the role of government to at least step up to the plate and try to make a commitment to try to close that gap, you know. So I'm just saying, many of us don't know about what has happened in the past with other decades, and we should use that as a model for what needs to happen now, at least with respect to that public commitment. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You could hear me clearly?
Yes.
So I'm going to try to answer that question in 3 pieces. I'm going to give a small case study. And the second piece, I'm going to talk about the Caribbean reparation movement. So my context and my entry point is from the Caribbean reparation movement. And my third piece, to support everything, what I've been hearing, like the common theme is like, how do we push the decade, right? The ideas of the decade, the benefits of the decade to civil society. So the third thing I want to talk about is young people and the creative arts and how we could politicize young people and inform civil society about the decade and the benefits of the decade. I think the young man at the back asked that question earlier on, right? Because we could speak about the decade and we could have this conversation, but what does it look like outside of that with the everyday people, right? Who just want to eat, thinking about today rather than the next 5 years, right? Open quotes. I acknowledge these words run very deep, indeed, but I do hope that as friends who have gone through so much together since those darkest times, we can move on from this painful legacy and continue to build for the future, close quotes. These were the words uttered from the mouth of the United Kingdom then Prime Minister David Cameron in his speech to a joint sitting of the Houses of Assembly in Jamaica in September 2015. Cameron's response was an attempt to address the call and actions for reparations that were made by the then Jamaican government, headed by the Honorable Portia Simpson Miller, to the British government for the crucial role in the inhuman practices of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the English Caribbean. Cameron urged the leaders that we should move forward from the past and think about the ways to work together. He stated that the UK plans to provide the Caribbean region with £360 million without stipulations. However, in one of his interviews with the Jamaican media, he yet downplayed the reparation argument and suggested that the UK wants to work with the Jamaican people in creating a prison that will house inmates from the UK with Jamaican heritage, and his government is willing to invest £25 million for that project. It is safe to say the Jamaican government discarded that entire project, right? Interestingly enough, just in the year preceding Cameron's trip to Jamaica, he visited Paula Nazi's death camp, lit a candle at the memorial, and wrote in the Book of Remembrance that the world should never forget. These actions displayed by the former Prime Minister of UK illustrate the continuous dehumanization process of people of African descent post-emancipation. Black bodies continue to be thingified or articulated as a Friday fact, open quotes. For instance, in March 2018, the Guardian newspaper published an article entitled, "When Will Britain Face Up Its Crimes Against Humanity?" to address, close quotes, to address a controversial tweet that was sent out by Her Majesty's Treasury profile. The tweet read, "Here's today's surprising Friday fact. Millions of you have helped end the slave trade through your taxes. Did you know? In 1843, Britain used £20 million, 40% of its national budget, to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. The amount of money borrowed for the Slavery Abolition Act was so large that it wasn't paid off until 2015, which means that British citizens helped pay to the end of the slave trade." End of tweet. The troubling tweet underlines the English Crown's celebration, mainly of its rolling abolition of slavery. However, what it shows is the continuous arrogance of whiteness and the thingification of blackness. It is important to note that the slave trade was abolished in 1807 and not 1823, as indicated above. Also, slavery was still taking place in the British Empire after 1833, for example, in Mauritius and the Cape Colony of South Africa. And freedom was not bought in 1838. Rather, enslaved Africans were forced to work without pay and were still punished until 1838. Now just think about it. Imagine being a descendant of an enslaved African and a taxpayer who unknowingly contributed to the repaying of a loan taken by British government to compensate the people and institutions that partook in the institutional slavery and own possible members of your family. This is the type of whiteness habituous of British government and the English monarchy. the exploitation of blackness articulated within a hashtag and celebrated by the Crown. This happening highlights the importance of the initiative of the Caribbean reparations movement and the conscious awakening of civil society around the issues being undertaken by the movement in itself. So now I want to talk about, so it shows you the context of where we're coming from, right, and the importance of the Caribbean reparation movement. And so far I've heard people talk about institutions not participating. So the thing about in the Caribbean context now, you have governments who are participating, right? You have institutions that are being built, but the governments are at the forefront. And for me now is how do we politicize people, particularly young people around reparations movement, right? So just giving a small history. In 2013, the 15 heads of the government of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, launched a reparation claim against the government of 8 European states for, one, the genocide perpetrated against 15 million indigenous people of Caribbean, and secondly, an array of crimes against humanity that were committed against the enslaved African people in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean reparation movement is not just recognizing Afro-Caribbean people, but also the indigenous people of the region. Indigenous people of the region have been tried to erase and claim that they're no longer there. So for example, if you go in St. Vincent, if you go in Belize, you still, in Dominica, you have the Garifuna people, you have people coming from that lineage of indigeneity, right? And just to save time, like a couple of the institutions that were found was the National Reparations Committee. So you have governments across CARICOM with national committees, and it's led by civil society. And the second thing as well, you have the Caribbean Reparations Commission, which is led by governments in itself. So governments are in conversation with everyday people, right? And the third thing that was established, and I recently spent some time in Jamaica, was the Center for Research and Caribbean Reparations. And it's a center that's focused on bringing information together, decimating data, and bringing access to everyday people, right? So one thing I want to highlight that we could learn from, I think, based on the conversation I heard today, was the 10-point action plan that was culminated by the CARICOM reparations, right? The first one was repatriation. The idea is going back. So someone mentioned, I believe it was my colleague Melissa from Guyana, that one thing that was done between, I think, Ghana and Guyana, that the idea of removing visas to have that kind of transportation. So some of you might be aware that in 2019 was the year of return. So you had a lot of people who going to Ghana, I should say, and being part of that culture and showing how ways you could invest and how you could assimilate in a society. So actually having that bridge without those barriers, right, such as visas. Second piece is, well, sorry, I should say the first piece was apology, repatriation, and the third one was Indigenous People Development Program. And it's not, Indigenous People Development Program not designed by Afro-Caribbean people, but in conversation with. So indigenous people coming to the table, 1 minute, oh praise the Lord. I feel like I've been speaking for 30 seconds. So indigenous people participate in the conversation. What does reparation looks like for them? So and reparations might look for indigenous people differently compared to Guyana or in a place like in Belize or in Dominica. And just to run through it, the fourth piece is cultural institutions. And cultural institutions are very important because a famous Barbadian activist and thinker mentioned, George Lamin, he mentioned that the arts are central in conceptualizing and moving a nation forward. It helps civilize a society. So cultural institutions are very important to that, right? The fifth aspect, public health. As some of you may be aware that the Caribbean have the highest rate per capita when it comes to diabetes and high blood pressure, right? The sixth one, illiteracy eradication. Access to proper education, access to facility, and also doing cultural exchanges. So for example, how do we open up channels for people in the Caribbean to probably go study in the African continent or in Europe, right? The seventh piece is African Knowledge Program. So a lot of times when we talk about Africa, to my understanding, my experience, right? they speak of Africa in a derogatory term. So it's like, how do we empower people in the region to think of Africa differently, think of their heritage differently, and how do they identify differently? Because we could speak about reparation, but it starts with self, right? Psychological rehabilitation. My colleague on my right mentioned about post-traumatic slave syndrome. Author and activist and intellectual Dr. Joy DeGruy wrote an excellent book about post-traumatic slave syndrome, about the intergenerational trauma we have carried since slavery, and what does that healing process look like. So the 10-point platform are thinking about those things. It's institutionalized, right? And the second one, the ninth one, sorry, is technology transfer. How do we get people in the Caribbean access to technology that that they didn't have access to, basically, right, due to slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. And the final one is debt cancellation. When you think of the case of Haiti and what Haiti is going through right now, right, you have to think about the money they had to pay right after emancipation and to independence to be self-identified as a nation. So such things as, and also you think about more contemporary economic institutions or programs such as SAP, structural adjustment programs. You think of the World Bank and the different, the policies they put on developing countries in regards to what they should develop and what development looks like for them, right? And the last thing I want to discuss moving forward is how do we get young people involved in those initiatives, right? The conversation has to step outside those institutions. How do we get everyday people to think about reparations? Like I would say, how do we make reparations sound sexy? Right, because I believe that's how we sell it to them. And my idea, what I proposed to CARICOM and the Center for Reparation Research is doing a youth arts project. So the idea is like you get young people from across the region and you bring them to institutions, whether it's a Howard or in the case of the Caribbean, CARICOM or Center for Reparation Research, and like you give them the necessary tools to go back to their communities. Right? What does reparation look like for them? Based on the information you found in those institutions, what does reparation look like for you in your respective country? Because what might work in a country like Guyana will not work in St. Lucia due to the ethnic diversity. You get what I'm saying? Right? So they come back and they present what it looks like. They go back to their countries and they do media. They do outreach to push the idea of reparation. How do we sell it? And let them understand what reparation means. Reparation doesn't mean chump change. Reparation in the Caribbean context is a systemic thing, right? It's a systemic issue. How do we disrupt the systems of neo-coloniality that's still embedded in the Caribbean region, right? And I think the 10-point platform addresses that completely. And thinking towards the future, I think young people need to be at the center of the process, the decision-making processes, in order to move forward. Because there's a generation gap, an intergenerational issue taking place where older folks do not want to open and give young people access to those spaces to partake in those conversations. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Justin, you asked about the reflections on the presentation by the Special Rapporteur, and I think of all the great, amazing things she said, I think that presentation was excellent. There are three things that I will hopefully cover in my presentation as well that really stood out for me. One is knowing and understanding and making use of international human rights law, understanding that there are precedents for reparation within international human rights law, and my research looks particularly at how transitional justice can be a scenery or a platform for reparation. To the links, which Nkechi was talking about as well, that making the links between historic injustice and contemporary injustice. And my research again looks at how violations of human rights in the context of the armed conflict in Colombia against Afro-Colombian people have their roots in, historic injustice in the context of colonialism and enslavement. And thirdly, the importance of transnational solidarity and how the reparation movement in Colombia is really reaching out to and looking to work together with movements and processes from CARICOM, from the US, and beyond as well. So I work for CODIS, which is a consultancy on human rights and displacement NGO in Colombia. And this organization has worked for 30 years looking at working on and denouncing and doing advocacy around violations of human rights against people, or violations of human rights of people in armed conflict in Colombia. And for many years has worked alongside Afro-descendant communities in processes of reparation and ethnic and territorial rights struggles. So my research is really based on the work I do directly with communities in Buenaventura around reparation. So the right to reparation, as the Special Rapporteur said, is a fundamental part of international human rights law, and transitional justice seeks to repair injustice and restore dignity to people who have experienced violations of their rights in the context of war and authoritarian regimes. And transitional justice has become increasingly focused on the rights of victims or survivors, looking for measures of restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction, and importantly, guarantees of non-repetition. And I argue in my research that when a transitional justice process takes place in a post-colonial context or a context of coloniality, rights will never be restored to the victims unless that transitional justice process takes a decolonial approach, looking with truth, justice, and reconciliation processes that recognize that contemporary injustice committed against victims are a consequence of the legacy of colonialism and the continued relations of coloniality that underpin contemporary society. In Colombia, my work shows how Afro-descendant communities working on reparation have really pushed the boundaries of transitional justice then to allow for a demand for what we call historic reparations as opposed to just reparations, contemporary reparations. So for those that are not familiar with the context of Colombia, contrary to the official statistics, probably around 25% or even more of the population is Afro-descendant. Afro-descendant people have been disproportionately affected by the armed conflict, particularly in the Pacific coast, Pacific region of the country, suffering from grave violations of human rights, including forced displacement, disappearances, assassination of leaders who are working tirelessly to defend territorial and ethnic and territorial rights. And all of these, this vulnerability of Afro-descendant communities is heightened by the lack of historic justice. So a colleague of mine who I work with says, the fact that there's never been a historic reparations process in Colombia has made us more vulnerable now in the context of the armed conflict because we're already suffering from violations of our basic economic, social, and cultural rights. There's never been, unlike other countries, some other countries in the region, there's never been an official apology by the state for enslavement. However, as my colleague Luis Ernesto mentioned, Law 70, which was adopted in 1993, is seen by many as a reparations law. It's a law that enshrines collective land titles for Afro-descendant communities, political participation, possibilities of own forms of education. So that is seen by many as a really important achievement in terms of historic justice. In 2011, the then president of the Republic, of the country, said that the country is in debt to the Afro-descendant population. This was in the framework of the 21st of May, which is the Day of Afro-Colombians. But as I say, there's never been an official apology. The demand for reparation in terms of who are seen as like the responsible party for, in the case of the CARICOM, for example, it's a state-to-state demand. In the US, you're talking more about civil society making demands on the state. In Colombia, we have, I think, both visions because while there is that historic debt from Spain, after independence from Spain, slavery continued in Colombia. So there's also responsibility from the national state. Transitional justice then in Colombia, there's a wide framework for transitional justice, which again looks at addressing the rights of victims of the armed conflict. And what my work looks at is how Afro-descendant communities have really pushed to develop that transitional justice framework to address specifically the rights of, the collective rights of Afro-descendant communities. So Law 1448, which is the victims' law in Colombia, addresses reparation or compensation for victims of violations of rights in the armed conflict. But through advocacy, Afro-descendant and indigenous communities as well managed to get a decree law, a kind of side law established, establishing collective rights to reparation, or rights to collective reparation for Afro-descendant communities. And that law recognizes the historic and structural causes of the damages that, and we call them damages in the language of reparation, affecting Afro-descendant people contemporary. It recognizes the right to collective reparations around land restitution, repairing cultural damage, or protecting culture, protecting visions. Okay, 1 minute. Wow, that went really quickly. I also wanted to point out how Afro-descendant communities within the framework of the peace agreement between the FARC and the government pushed to include what is called an ethnic chapter in that peace agreement, which recognizes again how Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples have suffered in the armed conflict as a result of the historical conditions of colonialism. So demands for reparations then include processes of autonomy, self-determination, land, access to land and territory, self-governance, and structural and economic change, recognizing that many of the contemporary violations of human rights take place in the context of neoliberal development projects. So it's really a very decolonial vision of reparations, and I think that's a really important element for reparations movements in other parts of the world to take into account. Where are we at the moment with the reparations movement? There is an agenda at the moment among several organizations that I work with to establish a reparations commission, a national reparations commission, very much inspired by the processes in CARICOM, in each of the countries of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and also the US process with NARC and NCOBRA. Which would study, starting off by studying the historic impacts of enslavement and then looking at measures, proposing measures to overcome those historic impacts. There's also visions to push for a law on reparations and a reparations fund. In 2017, we held an international conference on reparations in which we invited allies and comrades from the reparation movement from around the world. We had colleagues from the Jamaica Reparation Commission, St. Lucia as well, the US, and others, also people who had worked on the Mau Mau case as well. And I think what came out of that process was, yet again, the importance of transnational solidarity in the reparation movement, in inspiring each other in terms of our demands and our visions for reparation. PCN, which is the process of black communities in Colombia, who I work with a lot, are currently in the process of developing a national education process on reparation for Afro-descendant communities, which would, I think, be kind of a first step. My brother here mentioned the importance of, okay, this reparation movement in the case of the Caribbean comes very much from states. How do we then make sure that civil society is really involved in that? So this kind of first education process is with that in mind. Linking up with that, yeah, the importance of linking up with our brothers and sisters in the movement. And I think what Professor Henderson from the Leadership Conference said in his intervention earlier really resonated with me, which is that perhaps, you know, the fear of the issue of reparation is what really has states kind of not moving forward on the decade and not moving forward on a lot of this agenda. And I think if for anything, for me, that inspires me to push further on this reparation agenda. The Permanent Forum is going to be a really important space to bring together and to be able to have those discussions among reparations movements from different parts of the diaspora. So in conclusion, transitional justice has been in Colombia an important scene or an important space for discussing reparation because it gives us a language of truth, reconciliation, justice and reparation and guarantees for non-repetition, which I think is often missing from discussions on reparation. And part of the reason why the reparation movement is very vulnerable to criticism, or it's so easy to criticize, is because we're not having those discussions, or at least critiques from outside are not seeing their discussions, and they understand the demand for reparation is a demand for money without those wider discussions about systemic change, structural change, really analyzing the economic model that we have and how a reparations movement is part of an entire society actually coming up to face the historic injustice that has taken place in the country. And so, yeah, the process in Colombia is an important contribution to the movement as well because of that vision of structural change, the focus on land rights, the focus on territory, the focus on autonomy, and the focus on having an own vision of justice.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so looking at reparations. Reparations means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but there's certain categories that can't be denied when discussing reparations, and the first category is trauma, right? Trauma can be broken down into different categories too, but the first category of trauma is dehumanization. Now, in my world, which is the world of police violence against women, and I appreciate all these men's names that were mentioned, Mike Brown, Eric Gardner, all that. My world is women, so I'm saying Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland, Atiana Jefferson. These women are also being killed by the police, and we're being raped and beaten too. So just to make sure that this conversation includes women. Because that's traumatizing to us, okay? So in my world, they call dehumanization racial profiling, which is a misnomer, okay? In our collective world, it's dehumanization. And dehumanization breaks down into many different categories as well. And the overwhelming incident of dehumanization of African peoples is genocide. We are the survivors of massive genocide and Holocaust that continues today purely, okay, in mass killings and policies across the world. It's not ended. Therefore, we cannot have a discussion on reparations without a discussion on being the survivors of genocide. There is a question of the numbers and data and proving it and all that, and to that I say, we don't need any numbers, okay? You must accept the unequivocal fact that this world's economy was built on the lives, bodies, blood, and death of African people. The Anglo-European world and its descendants must accept their moral depravity, dehumanizing and genocidal laws, policies, and practices in regards to African people, okay? So let me give you two examples of reparations in real time when it comes to Illinois. Let me say first that I talked to my dad about reparations. I told him I was gonna come here and talk about reparations, and he asked me if I was gonna ask for money or half of the United States. Now, yeah, I expected you guys to laugh, because when I asked that we have the cannabis industry, people laughed too, okay? It is not a laughing matter to have half of the United States when we know we're at the foundation of that country's economy, right? When Professor Vereen Shepherd in 2017 at our regional meeting asked for the industry, because it would be us not asking them for anything, right? We would be establishing this industry. And you're from Jamaica, supposedly the ganja capital.
St. Lucia, but it's okay.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, she's from Jamaica, the ganja capital of the world. In 2017, she said, this is what we want, because then we don't have to ask you for any money, right? I went to Governor Pritzker in Illinois, and we were in a white suburb, and I walked up to him and I said, we want the marijuana industry. And he was like, yeah, well, I'm gonna do everything I can to make sure that the people most impacted get a piece of this industry. And I said, no, we want it as a part of reparations, you know, which made him swallow, right? So here's what we got. Illinois is the first state to legalize marijuana, or as they call it, cannabis, sales through a legislative process. It wasn't a vote. It didn't go out to the people and on a referendum and say, do you want marijuana to be legalized? The state legalized marijuana recreationally. That's the first. The new law will provide financial aid to minorities in the industry. It is providing grants and loans to minorities. They call it social equity, and they're going to review it in 2021 to make sure that African peoples and people of color have equal access to the $77 billion industry. $77 billion in 2024. It's not stopping, it's going up. The large majority of this marijuana industry right now is owned by who? There you go. The legislation in Illinois is going to result in 750,000 expungements of marijuana convictions. We're the only ones doing that. And we're the only ones doing it on that level. So if your state presently does not have marijuana legalization and recreation, you need to look at Illinois' law and make sure that your state does this. Now, realize the federal government still has not legalized marijuana. So we have an opportunity to tell the federal government when they legalize it, and it will happen. You only need 26 states, and then you have more than half the states, so it can become legalized. We're at 11 or 13 right now when it comes to recreational, and we're at 33 when it comes to medical. So when it happens, we need to make sure that we're there telling them we want social equity, okay? We want a part of this industry, okay? And we want the expungements. We want our people out of jail for selling this, okay? Now, here's some facts about the industry. The marijuana industry could soon be worth more than the GDP of 9 states. Cannabis employs 5 times as many Americans as coal. The median marijuana salary is 10% higher than the US median salary, which is $52,000. You make $58,000. Investors poured $10 billion into the North American marijuana industry in 2018. Colorado made $35 million off of the marijuana industry in 2016. Marijuana policing, and I know this is low, marijuana policing cost Americans $3.6 billion in the first decade of the 2000s, $3.6 billion. The US marijuana market is worth $52 billion right now. 87% of those sales are on the black market, okay? There will be a 76% increase in cannabis jobs, okay? And as I told you, I'm sorry, it's the economic impact could reach as high as $77 billion in 2022. And this is an estimate, so we know it's gonna be higher than that. So let me talk about my city's role when it came to police violence. So Chicago fought for reparations against police torture by a convict named John Burge. He's an ex-cop, and he was a police officer at the Chicago Police Department. We settled for $7 million. We asked for 25. It was a historical settlement, but we only got 1/5 of what we asked for. The entire campaign started in the 1970s. And the settlement was approved in 2015. I want to mention my cousin, Standis Willis, who was the first person to bring this to the United Nations. And we used human rights mechanisms to get this work done, to get him both convicted and then also to come back with the voices of many of the mothers and wives of these guys who were imprisoned through confessions of torture.
Krista, I wanted to make sure that there's some people in the international audience who may not be familiar with the situation to which you're referring.
Okay. This guy, John Burge, we believe that he learned how to torture in Vietnam. So he would take African men and women, and he would hook them up to these electrical boxes, and he would hook up their genitalia to these electrical boxes and shock them.
As a police officer, correct? As a police chief?
I think it was the police chief.
Police chief.
He wasn't a chief.
He wasn't a chief?
No, he was, I think the highest he got was a commander.
Okay.
He would put, he and his cronies, because we haven't gotten his cronies, we just got him. Well, they were in different areas. They were in Area 2 and Area 3, and torture was happening all over the city of Chicago in police departments when it came to confessions. He would put bags over their heads, tie them. They kicked chairs out from underneath people's feet. They beat them savagely, you know. And so Standis, there was two brothers in particular, I think their names were the Williams brothers, and they were accused of killing a cop. And they beat them into these confessions. Now, they never were acquitted of killing the cop. But what happened was they started the information on the street, right? You know, people started talking, and they were saying, no, not only were these guys tortured, but I was tortured, and it just kept going, you know. And I hope that when you all are listening to me, you hear me telling you how these things work, right? It starts with one person, okay? So we know a movement that started with one person talking out. Me too, right? One person, and then the deluge. So Stan wrote a report to the UN about police torture. And we kept coming back to the UN saying, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. And then we came back and we said, and they're also shooting and killing us on the street. They're also beating and raping us. And as Wade said, we were there in 2014 talking about police violence when Mike Brown was shot. And it did make a major change in the way the UN was addressing police violence. You know. But we came back. That was August. We came back in November, and the kids of We Charge Genocide stood up with their fist in the air for 20 minutes in honor of the amount of time that Rekia was laying in the street shot in her head. And that brought about a movement. They came home. This was on the table. The mothers had written stories about how they felt about their sons being tortured and killed by the police. It made it into the concluding observations, and came back to Chicago, and we settled for $5 million.
Krista, we're going to have to move forward, I think, to the next panelist, but can we give Krista a round of applause for her presentation here? This is very helpful. I know we're short on time, but if anyone has a question, yes, please approach the microphone. I see a few questions getting queued up, so as people queue up, I'll take the moderator's prerogative. Also, if there's anybody online who has a question, please type it into the chat box. And while people are lining up, I'm going to ask one question. So when we convened this panel, one of our organizing principles was this feeling that each of you were involved in some sort of success on the issue of reparations. We know that we had Krista discuss what happened in Chicago, where they did get $7 million, even though they asked for 25. We know Colombia has had these reforms that took place in the aftermath of the war there. We know CARICOM has had their 10-point plan. I know recently the University of West Indies has been in some sort of discussion with the University of Glasgow around some sort of amount of reparations. And here in the United States, we've had two major situations happen recently involving theological seminaries. We had the Princeton Theological Seminary claim 25 million, I believe, in reparations was going to be given, and we had the Virginia Theological Seminary claim $1.7 million in reparations given. But however, in your presentations, none of you seemed to feel like this was in any way sufficient for a number of reasons. It seemed like, in one sense, I know Esther talked about the need for a decolonial framework when thinking about reparations. I know Krista talked about the ongoing wealth being generated by the marijuana industry, and an industry which itself preyed on black people throughout the last 30 or 40 years, in particular with the war on drugs, and how that should be the basis of reparations. We know that, Nkechi talked about how the oppression was so thorough during enslavement as to be constitutional, as to be something which encompassed all aspects of our lives, that of course it would seem like such a pittance to see this small amount being generated by these two seminaries. And we know in the Caribbean context as well, we've seen consistent patterns of underdevelopment in the Caribbean, which many scholars, including Howard's own Eric Williams, has talked about over the course of many years. And we have this plan which has yet to involve the youth as leaders in the reparations movement. So far, there's been a generational gap, and the youth have not had their voice recognized as such. But I guess one thing I would ask before we go to the long line of questioners, since we agree that all of the reparations efforts which have taken place in each of these four situations have been, in some sense, not enough, insufficient. What, if you could distill it to one small point, since we have many questions coming, what would be the priority in terms of fixing these insufficient efforts at reparations? We know you outlined things that you'd want to see in terms of your vision for the future, but is there some major limitation where you could say one major intervention in the current process would maybe make a big difference?
Well, I would just say the very, very least common denominator in the United States, and that's the very least common denominator, is to pass H.R. 40, which is the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. It doesn't give not one bit sent to anybody. It's a commission to study the issue. That's the least common denominator, and first and foremost within that is unfettered apology from the United States government. I say unfettered because there was an apology that came out of the Senate a number of years ago, but it came with strings. It said, okay, well, we're going to apologize, but you cannot use our apology for any claim for reparations that you might have. The audacity, So those are just the very least common denominator on the road to reparatory justice.
All right, thank you.
For me, I mean, they have so many things I could identify, but I want to focus on young people and being part of the process. And for me, that's central, because in the Caribbean, we are in a very unique position. Yes, we have our challenges when it comes to reparations and the systems and the institutions, but I think, for me at least, I think about it that slavery is a 400-year process, right? and we are still living with neocolonialism. So it will take time. And I think it's politicizing people. When you look at the history of the Caribbean and social movements that were dismantled because the everyday people were not aware of those movements and what their agendas were, right? So I think it's central that we politicize civil society, but then young people have to be central in that. So in case when older folks get burned out, because you always hear the issue, or the struggle, or movements being crumpled up or being broken down because the people that were involved for 20, 30 years are burnt out, right? So what kind of system we put in place that could be less difficult to transfer, you get what I'm saying, transfer the ideologies, transfer the issues we deal with to young people to carry on that battle, to move it further.
All right.
Right, and just to address one more thing, I forget to mention about the $25 million plan with University of Glasgow and University of the West Indies that took place in August, where they're going to create research center going to be at the University of the West Indies, and one is going to be in Glasgow as well. And since then, several other universities have actually reached out to UWI to talk about their role in slavery, right? Thanks.
Thank you.
Obviously, the first or the main issue is implementation. In our case, there's a wide normative framework on ethnic territorial rights, reparations in Colombia, but they're not being implemented. But that's obviously an action from the government in terms of implementing the commitments that they've made. I think in terms of the movement, I want to put emphasis on the truth component that I keep mentioning in the framework of a transitional justice language, because I think a really important part is about memory. It's about knowing our history, knowing the true dimensions of enslavement and colonialism and the crimes that were committed, because often society in general is not even aware of the reality of those. So there's a huge backlash against any group of people that start to talk about reparation because they don't know the reality of the crimes, the serious grave crimes against humanity that have been committed and are continuing to be committed. So I think the truth component is important. There's a project in the UK at the University College London called the British Slavery Legacy Project, I think it's called, where one of the things that they've done is create a database on all of the money that was paid as a compensation to slavers when they lost their assets at the end of slavery. There's a database where you can look up any surname. I think you can also look up private businesses and know who was paid and how much they were paid in compensation. I think that making things like that visible as part of a truth process is an important element of the reparations process, because that huge injustice that was done to then compensate those responsible for the crime, while those victims of the crime have never been even recognized, is an important step.
All right. Thank you. Krista?
There's a boat selling and we want to get on it. I don't know how many of you all own Apple stock or have technology stock, but if you didn't get on that one, then you need to get in on the cannabis one. That boat is sailing, and it's up to us to make sure we get on that boat, okay? We may not have wanted to be on that first one, but we want to be on this one, okay? Right. That's an absolute.
All right. Thank you. All right. So, questions?
Right. Hello. First of all, I would like to thank you all so much for your very impassioned presentations about reparations. It is indeed an issue of a great concern and is certainly a cornerstone of what we are and who we are in our path towards realizing the three themes of the International Decade for People of African Descent, which is justice, development, and recognition. Of course, it falls quite heavily on justice. But then, here comes my question. I was fascinated because my background is decolonization and decolonial process, so I'm glad that it has been brought up. I feel that indeed, agreeing with Esther, that we need to work a little bit more to define what do we mean by this decolonial process, in as much as it's juxtaposed against the whole discussion on reparation. The mechanisms that were used to erase us, to exclude us, to negate us, to subsume us, to dehumanize us are exactly the same mechanisms that were used to give that sense of superiority, the sense of entitlement, the sense of we are larger than life, and also entitlement to just steal from us and take everything that has been taken over the years. So that is quite true. And that's why we need to really address those mechanisms and how they are impacting upon our lives today and contributing to the exclusion and the specific manifestations of Afrophobia that we are experiencing, not just here, but also beyond. Now, I feel that there is a certain danger, in as much as I am very much fascinated about the presentation and really convinced about the presentation here. I feel that we should be cautious about certain dangers that are perhaps not well articulated, in my opinion, if I may just mention it. One of them is we are estimating a certain homogeneity among us, whereas we are extremely heterogeneous on so many levels, on so many conceptual, epistemological, cultural identification. Our whole personhood and belonging is very heterogeneous. Africa is a continent, and not only that, the people of African descent all over the world globally have got very different manifestations and articulations of what they feel is owed to them. So how are we going to put it all down into a single story? There's a danger in having a single story, even though we are all very much feeling that we are owed and we need that single story attained to. So we have to be very careful, in my opinion, about the terminologies that we use. If we continue to identify ourselves in terms of slavery and colonialism, we are shortchanging ourselves. We are defining ourselves in terms of our lack of agency, in terms of we are shortchanging our ancestors who died and shed blood for us. They fought and they struggled, and it was in the basis of their agency that we are where we are now. And we need to acknowledge that and go beyond just slavery, go beyond just colonization, because beyond that, there is so much strength that binds us. And in talking about that, I feel that we should go into a review of the terminologies that we are using. Use more primordial terminologies, ancestrally grounded terminologies that really define who we are. If my great-great-great-grandmother was to wake up right now and ask me what I'm doing, I'm sure fundamentally she will agree with what I'm doing, because she was the greatest feminist at her time. At her time, she fought for fathers, our grandfathers. She said to me, they used to dance and say, the grandfathers, please let our girls be married when their breasts have shown. So because to just make them not marry their children when they were babies. That was my great-great-great-grandmother. So they know what it is to be owed. But they've got different ways to fight for it. We need to find terminologies that embrace all of us and embrace all our struggles. We need, in defining terminologies that embrace us, we will then know how to translate them, because a lot of times we forget that we are like a Tower of Babel. We are all talking in a language, our colonial language, yet another of those issues that have been erased from us. We are talking in a colonial language. It makes it sometimes difficult to translate certain issues. It makes it difficult to articulate certain issues, and a lot of things get lost in translation. A lot of our organization just unravel, like the Tower of Babel, because it gets lost in translation. Why? Because it's not our language. We're not speaking from our heart. We are not speaking from our heart and soul. Translation also includes certain terminologies that are not subject to the colonial tongue's words, because they are very much ancestrally grounded, as I said before. So they cannot be.
I was going to say, in the interest of time, we're going to have to.
So I'm just going to just finish with one sentence, one comment. One, we need. Two things. One, it's very important to know that in order to reach that end point of reparation, we have got to first address all these other issues too. An apology is imperative, but an apology without action, an apology without acknowledgement, because an apology will, exactly the action will be automatically then reparation. And then finally, I feel that there has to be a way in which we can allow everybody who is all of us, because we are also for one, Ubuntu, we are one, but then we are heterogeneous, but we need to involve everybody, the ordinary man, to also have access to the spaces in which they can partake in these conversations. And when I look around here, honestly, it hurts me. It hurts me that with our limited budget, we are so few here, and yet there's so much that needs to be told out there. So we need to make sure that what we are doing here is relevant, that we give everyone who is here a sense of entitlement, of ownership, a sense of that they are representative, there's a representativity and participation and mutuality. And that is what will get us to where we need to
All right,
get.
thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Why don't we hear everybody's
Yeah, I
comments, and then we can do a
I think that's what we're gonna do, right? So
Keep it down, please.
On recommendation from the panelists here, we're gonna have everybody state their questions succinctly. Hopefully, we're gonna be able to keep that under a minute, and then we'll have the entire panel respond. So thanks so much.
Cool, thank you. Much respect to the panel, really inspiring. In particular, I would like to speak with the sister Christine about the issue you just highlighted. It's something that affects my own family personally, so much respect for the work that you're doing, absolutely. The question I've got is for Sister Nkichi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you.
My tongue has been colonized, so I pronounce it Nikichi.
Much respect, Sister Nkichi. So, first of all, I want to send a greeting from my colleagues at Global African Congress. Before I came out here, brothers Glenroy Watson and Brother Abu recounted a story of hearing you speak at a historic Baptist church in New York. They described the journey from the airport. They arrived weary and tired, and they said that hearing you speak, they felt, a shudder go over them, and almost like you were reading their mind, and they felt that they were among family that they'd never met. So I just wanted to extend that welcome. My question, really briefly, I agreed with everything you said, absolutely, and I'm asking this question from a place of optimism and hope. With the Roma, right now in the UK, the current Home Office Minister, a woman of Indian descent, she's now pushing for legislation that attacks their communities. And for those that don't know, Roma are basically a traveler community who live nomadically. She's now bringing in legislation, despite the EU frameworks, despite the UN frameworks, to attack them. And in recent weeks, their caravan sites have been burned down. And you're right, their frameworks and their recognition at the international body level is where we want to be. But if we were there, we're still not protected. So from a position of optimism, I just wondered if there was any comment on that in terms of something that Sister Fannin mentioned, that there is a limitation with these international bodies. I'm sure we all appreciate. And just if there was any thoughts on that.
All right,
Much
thanks.
respect.
All right. Next.
Thank you for your presentation. It means just one thing, what it is happening in Guadeloupe, French Caribbean island, where we are suing since 5 years the states for reparation on the main issue of land restitution.
Which island is that?
Guadeloupe.
Guadeloupe.
But I want to make a comment on your presentation. I heard about reparation for different things. And for me, as reparation has to be a decolonial process, it's not only to ask for reparation, no apologize, there is no way for apologize, but for reparation. And if we are asking reparation, it also because during the Grand Découverte from 1492, the great discovery, there is one thing, it was totally destroyed. It was the sense of humanity, the intersubjectivity, the alterity. And it is absolutely with the implementation of the race policy as a way to hierarchize humanity, this sense of humanity was broken. And what we have to achieve with this reparation process, decolonial reparation process, is to restore the sense of humanity through reparation. And therefore, reparation can be only a collective project, and a collective project unfinished because it is decolonial, and decolonial is something not achieved, but a decolonial process of love. Love. And we have to, no, it's very important. It's very important. It's not only to claim something for us, it's also claiming something for us, but also for the other. Not only for Afro-descendant people and Africans, but also for white people, in order to restore the sense of humanity. And therefore, it will oblige us to redefine exactly what does it mean to be human? What does it mean universality? What does it mean humanity? And if we want to really achieve the process, decolonial process of reparation, we have to take that in mind and never to lose it.
All right, thank you. All right. Next question.
Just seconding what the brother from the UK said, this panel, I really appreciate the energy and the knowledge and commitment to the issue on the part of all the speakers, so thank you. Very quickly, my basic question is, you know, I'm of the perspective that we as African and African descendant peoples should always be pushing our own energy, pushing our own knowledge, using our own skills and talents. Obviously, I don't think there's any way ever to, in any financial form, account for the complete devastation of what the Maafa was and even trans-Indian Ocean, Pacific, other experiences. But do you think this process can occur on the legal and financial levels without there being a strong educative component? Because in my experience, part of the reason that there's a huge gap on the part of, let's say, the European or Western American whites to understand even the concept is due to their tremendous lack of knowledge on the issue. So don't we need to have some kind of like strong historical literary movement that's not just us, but that gets into their framework so that they can get understanding? I'm thinking of books like by Randall Robinson, The Debt, or, you know, Laz, My Teacher Told Me, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you guys would all have much more better recommendations, but do you see what I'm saying? Doesn't there need to be some other kind of sensitization movement that can help open up their minds so they can understand, and not have this knee-jerk reaction, you know? Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to say that I think one of the most important things that we have to do is work on the permanent forum. That will be beyond the next 4 years. I'm Marion, again, from Afro-Americas, and my question, first of all, I just want to say, we are like 4 miles from Britain's first colony, which was Virginia. It was not in Africa, not in Asia, not the Caribbean, Virginia. And so for the brother from St. Lucia, who is between Canada and St. Lucia, I think, and also for Nkechi, Black Americans are older than the United States. We predate this state, and I think there's a human rights issue there too. It was not just Britain, it was the Netherlands. They had New Amsterdam, New Netherlands, which is now New York. Harlem is a Dutch name. Sojourner Truth spoke Dutch before she spoke English. The French had a huge area called La Louisiane. And I'm sure that Mireille, I don't remember if she and I have discussed this very much, but France does not want to think about Louisiana, but they left behind not just the history of slavery, Europeans left behind the population of us Black Americans, who most of us are part European. This was not just a slavery colony, it was the white settler colony. So, and also for Esther, and thank you, Esther, because one of the first things that anybody can do is to stop lying. Recognition and start telling the truth. But when I come to the UK, both of my parents have Scottish names. I didn't even know that Nichols was a Scottish name until a few years ago because we're so alienated from our actual history. But when will our Caribbean cousins who speak English include us, because we were created from British and Dutch and French and Swedish slavery, but especially British. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'll keep my question very brief. So I'm a second-year law student at Georgetown Law School, and my question is essentially around what do we do in the meantime until we see any effort for reparations. During my first year at Georgetown, there were various incidents of, just like racial microaggressions, and towards the end of the first year, I experienced a directed attack by a professor and had to navigate that process well into the summer and even still now. And so at some point over the summer, I realized that trying to navigate that process and get what justice looked like for me, it was taking a lot of energy, emotional energy, away from just being happy, just period. And also, just getting work done at my internship and, building my career. And so at some point over the summer, I decided that I just had to rest that aside for a minute and focus more on myself and on creating some sense of independence and empowerment for myself, because I recognized after a certain point that although I was following all of the procedures that are available at my school, there was not going to be any form of justice in the near future. And he is returning and teaching next semester, and so as I'm, getting ready to go into the next semester, I'm just wondering if you all have any recommendations around for African American Black people here in the country now, how do we find a sense of empowerment and healing in the meantime?
All right, thank you.
I just want to say thank you for letting us know about that and having the courage to tell us.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Bueno, es una pregunta muy directa.
This is a very direct question regarding the decade. One of the mandates that the decade has is information about the forum, the permanent forum of Afro-descendants. And, well, it's down on paper, but in practice, what's been asked is that we define the UN organization that is going to be set up for that. There's a proposal that it would be in the Human Rights Council, and now therefore to be in ECOSOC. Now, talking about reparations, for that to be effective, and also regarding structure, because we have spoken here about the difference that we have, even though this is a diaspora. You've got Africa with its manifold differences, Afro-Europeans themselves with many marked differences, different from what we have in Latin America and the Caribbean. So how should this forum be put together, regionally speaking? Because the UN doesn't want this to be viewed as something of the Americas. It hasn't taken into account the subdivisions that we have in our own region here. So that's one question. How should that forum be structured? And what mechanism do you think would make it possible for us to see follow through on the issue of reparations and also regarding the carrying out of what was set forth in the decade?
Thanks to all our panelists. I'm struck by two themes together in this conversation. One, the imperative necessity, central vitality of reparations as a matter of justice. And at the same time, also hearing the inadequacy, the innate inadequacy, the way that reparations can't possibly restore and repair all that was done, stolen, taken, destroyed. And so I wanted to introduce or see if our panelists are interested in introducing into the conversation about reparations, aligning reparations alongside a call for economic and social rights. I'm thinking of the US context, which is quite hostile to these rights, to housing, education, healthcare, and jobs. But thinking about maybe the innate finitude of reparations as feeling unsatisfactory and wondering if a more open textured economic and social rights that are ongoing could help to continue our response to the problem that Mr. Eugene pointed out was 400 years in the making and more.
All right, thank you. And this is the last question, and then we'll have some short responses by the panelists, and then we're going to have to move right into the following panel for interest of time.
Okay. Quisiera agradecer al panel por la.
I would like to thank the panel for the presentations that they made. But I have something to say about the international framework for reparations and the conversation that we had over lunch with Sakura and Salima about the issue of our having forgotten the plan of action and the Durban Declaration. We seem to have overlooked, and that is the roadmap essentially for reparations, toward reparations. And that's why I think that we need to place the conference within its context. Last month, in the hearings of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, this university's law school, Howard Law School, held a hearing on reparations for Afro-Americans. And the state's response was that they didn't have any background or experience in the matter of reparations, and they mentioned the framework by the United States within the context of the Second World War and reparations paid to the Japanese in internment camps. And so the decade, as such, let's not forget that that declaration was nearly not issued because the Durban umbrella was used for the purpose of designing it, and it was said, why couldn't we Durbanize, so to speak, the decade rather? And so that's really a smoke screen that we have on reparations in the decade, and that's why I'm adamant that we need to go back to Durban. We cannot forget that that is our main roadmap forward.
All right, so there were some questions online. I don't think, unfortunately, we'll have time to go into depth on all of the questions. I know one question was, is the fact that UE is receiving money from enslavers but not involving civil society, a statement that suggests that it is not reparations that's taking place under Esther's definition. I think there's more desire to learn more about this decolonial approach to reparations. I think there are many questions about the details of that. There's also a question, can we give examples of youth reparation movements or approaches encountered from anybody on reparations movements involving youth? I think Krista might be able to speak to that, as the We Charge Genocide effort in Chicago was, it seemed to me, a project that involved many youth activists in Chicago. So that is the case. And then finally, another question was for people speaking from the perspective of Christians in the United States and abroad, what would reparations look like for them? How would the faith community be involved in authentically making a statement on reparations in light of the fact that the doctrine of discovery, which was the basis for enslavement being launched as a global project, was first articulated by the Catholic Church? So a number of questions here. I know you don't have time to respond to them all or even most of them, But if you have one short closing statement that might be responsive to one of these questions, please indulge.
Okay, there was a whole lot.
Water hose.
I mean, dang. And with respect to Durban, I'm just going to put the word. You know, we really need to make real what the whole thing about the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement, et cetera, being a crime against humanity, which is something that came out of Durban, and we really need to really accentuate that. I know someone spoke to Roma. Yes, there are definitely limitations to international bodies. I hope none of us feels that this is the end all in terms of the UN and anything that we're doing with respect to this. There really needs to be internal reparations as well. Reparations ourselves, where we are healing ourselves and our own communities, etc. That addresses a number of the things that have been brought up. Also, in terms of, I think, there are a number of different stages to reparations, reparatory justice, and restorative justice is part of that as well. And there's a whole body with respect to that. I'm not just talking about in the criminal justice context. With the Georgetown student, what do we do in the meantime? Or there's something we used to say back in the 70s, agitate, educate, and organize. That's what we need to be about. Agitate, educate, and organize throughout. And then I think, yeah, why don't I just end it there? But I have passed out, I have a couple more left. These fact sheets on HR 40, my contact information is on the back of this. I didn't really talk about the legislation that's currently before Congress, but there's a couple of them here at the end if anybody wants to take those. That's all.
Thank you.
So I want to touch on a few things. First and foremost, I want to apologize to the organization. There's only so much I could say in 7 minutes. The youth organization in Guyana who is doing amazing work around reparation. However, it's limited to one group in Guyana. So they're doing amazing work and hopefully they could spare it in the future. So I just want to answer the last question you asked, Fire, coming from outside. So if you're listening in Guyana, I apologize. Keep on doing the work. Second thing, in regards to UE and money. One thing about the Caribbean reparation movement, you don't go to the bank and get a check. It's invested within society. Right? So in the sense of UE getting money, the money is not necessarily to pay off a student loan, but to create infrastructure. So if you remember, one of the points I made in the 10-point platform is the cultural institutions. And the Reparation Center, the research center, is an example of a cultural institution. Right? So, and the thing about the reparation discourse, it's a very big thing. So you could enter the conversation in different ways. So a lot of people always say, why are academics speaking for us? Or why are certain people speaking for us? The academics are speaking within the educational institution because that's what they've been specialized in, that's what they've been skilled in. So if you have social activists who are doing stuff around religious, then you reach out to your church, you reach out to those particular institutions that were you skilled in, right? So we could enter the discourse in different ways. So it's not limited to one group of people later, but how do we enter the conversation? I really want to speak on the decolonial piece. Like I said, there's so much you could say in 7 minutes. And for me, when I think about reparations in my research, I go back to Frantz Fanon in regards to the idea of human, what it means to be human. And I'm going to use that within the Caribbean context. So within my work, I'm thinking of, okay, what does reparation look like in the Caribbean context? Right? How do we use our Caribbean radical creative imagination to think about humanity and what it means for us to be human? Right, so the idea of decoloniality, which is a continuation, is a process of continuation, I think looks differently in different spaces. Mm-hmm. So the idea of blackness, the idea of reparation, I don't think it's a one fix all thing. I think we need to look at the history of those particular spaces of those regions and what does reparation look like in that space. So I respect your comment in regards to the diversity. So for me, I try to stick with the Caribbean context and what we could. Because even the Caribbean itself is diverse in itself. And like I highlighted, what might work in Guyana might not work in St. Lucia because of the diversity in Guyana, right? And because of the Afro population in St. Lucia. Another thing, I think the young brother raised an interesting question. What's the role of education in the issue? And for that, again, I draw to Caribbean. I look at history and see what I could learn from history, what can we learn from history, and put it in a contemporary framework. When you look at folks like Walter Rodney, what Walter Rodney did, he went into supposedly ghettos. He went into areas that governments will not go in and sit with everyday people to hear what they have to say. So I think the conversation don't necessarily have to be in classrooms or big educational institution, but how do we get that conversation outside? We go to the communities where people are. If you don't have access to the community, you see who are the community leaders in the space who are already doing the work, right? How do you connect and how do you build with them, and how do you take that information and bring it to the people, and how do they think and conceptualize reparations? Right, because like I said, it might look different for them. Whether it's through infrastructure, how do they get access to the infrastructure, right? Because when you talk about education and how, there's also something we have to discuss. There's a class aspect to that, right? So not everybody have access to that or understand how that works. So that's something for us to think about, right? Coloniality, that's some amazing questions. Thank you for all of them.
Yeah.
The sister asked about her Caribbean cousins. One thing, like I said, is very limited the things I could say in, give me 1 second, because the Caribbean context, I know David Commission just came from Senegal, where he presented a Caribbean reparations to the AU there. And one thing he suggested is that we need to have a transnational, which goes back into the question, the original question that you asked, and the very first speaker. We need to have a transnational movement around reparations, right? And so what does that look like? And that's something for us to think about, for us to develop. I don't think it's just like, okay, we come and give you solutions. I think all of us have a responsibility to go within our societies and study and see what is happening. And just based on what I heard the speakers before me and other panels, they're doing amazing work. So then we bring this information together and think about, okay, what does a working relationship look like in the Caribbean, to Colombia, to Brazil, right? So it's for us to think about those things, right? And just to answer the question about the American cousins, a coalition have been formed with a reparation commission in the U.S. So I could tell you what I understand, right? So these things have been formed. It might not be to the specific things you want it to be, but these relationships do exist. And how do you go back and how do you engage? Because me being in the Caribbean, I don't want to speak for people living a particular history and reality in the U.S. because I can't speak to that. I could only speak to that through dead thinkers and dead scholars and what I see in the news and have an external perspective that's not reflective of what's happening here. So I come here, listen to what you have to say, but what I could say is a bridge have already been established with that dialogue. Because we, in the Caribbean, like I was saying earlier to someone, we try to fix our house first before we tell you what your house should look like. And not, I won't say backyard, but I would say our basement, because in the basement, that's where you hide everything, right? So we need to clean up our basement, then, okay, what does that working relationship look like? How can we support you? So even the question you asked about the decolonial piece, I love it so much, because for me, it's like, how do we use our creative imagination within our respective spaces to envision what that looks like? Right. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to address the question by the lady here when you mentioned economic, social, and cultural rights. There's a lot of different visions of what reparation is. It's not always material in terms of like a check, although I think indemnization, do we say? The compensation element is a very, very important element of reparation. But there are also demands for reparation around economic, social, and cultural rights. But I think we have to be careful not to confuse things and not to allow states to scapegoat the issue of reparations and the issue of historic justice by doing actions that already are part of their general obligations under human rights law. So I think it would be very easy for states to start doing great political public policies around health, education, everything else. They should be doing that anyway, right? That's part of their general obligations under human rights law, and I think it's important to make sure we're using a language and understanding of historic justice when we talk about reparation. The question on, God, there's so many questions here.
Yeah. Can't answer them all.
The decolonial vision of reparations as well. I think Mireille, Fanon, and already my brother here have already addressed that issue a lot. But it's I think from the work that we're doing, it's also it's a focus on collective. And a collective vision for reparation, a collective vision for our own vision of development and our own vision of what we want our lives and our realities to look like, that goes beyond perhaps the model of modernity that was imposed through colonialism. It's about recognizing, first of all, that we're still in a context or in a paradigm of coloniality, that although there were processes of decolonization, we are not decolonized. So it's about also that going back again to the truth issue. It's about about kind of decolonizing our minds and our understandings of the very world that we live in. And yeah, having our own solutions and our own visions for what we want our lives to be. And so that's why I think that also the pieces around autonomy and self-determination are incredibly important. And that goes back to my brother Christian's presentation on the importance of recognition as a people. Because when we're recognized as a people, then we have rights as a people. That's how we translate it into Spanish, because he said pueblos, a people as opposed to people, right? With then the autonomy to make our own decisions about how we view our world, how we view our environment, how we access and use our resources. Hernando, I agree with you completely on the DDPA. That's the fundamental instrument in terms of understanding reparation. We mentioned at the beginning of the panel and with the Special Rapporteur the importance of international human rights law, and there is already an existing framework. The resolution that came out just a year ago and follow-up on Durban even goes beyond Durban. Because it uses the actual word reparations. I don't know if you guys know this resolution 73262 of the General Assembly, which says, welcoming the call upon all former colonial powers for reparations, consistent with paragraph 157 and 158 of the Durban Programme of Action, to redress the historical injustices of slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade. So I think, as far as I know, that's the first time the actual word reparation is used in these documents, as opposed to other words like historic justice or restorative or whatever. So that is always going to be our anchor in terms of these discussions. And the Permanent Forum then, I agree, is at this moment a priority in terms of the decade. I know we're going to have a space in a minute to talk about it, so I won't go into it too much, but it's essential that the Permanent Forum is a body that has teeth, a body that has access to decision-making processes at the highest levels of the UN. For that reason, many of us are pushing for a permanent forum under the ECOSOC structure of the UN. There are interests that the permanent forum would be under Human Rights Council. I think that would make it less weak. And when we're talking about issues around reparation and transformative processes, structural processes and changes, there's probably an interest that permanent forum wouldn't be as strong as we'd like it to be, and that's probably why there are interests in it being under Human Rights Council. So I think we have to push for an extremely strong permanent forum with resources, but with also access to decision-making, which should, of course, have representation from all regions. Going back to the issue of memory, I want to also just reiterate the importance of the Afro-descendant diaspora in Latin America in all of these processes, because we talk a lot about Durban, we mustn't forget to talk about Santiago. Yeah, because the precursor of Durban was Santiago, and the reason, or what enabled Afro-descendant rights as an issue and as a category to be included in Durban was the work done by Latin American, mainly Afro-descendant people at Santiago in 2000. So I think it's also a process of having memory about how our movements and our processes have got to where we are now, and making sure that the international spaces we have now reflect and recognize and respect those journeys that we've taken.
Thank you. All right, last short word. Krista.
Yeah, well, when we're thinking of reparations, the first thing we have to remember is that women are a part of that, okay? And never forget that. And we're presently not paid the same amount, so one of the first things we can do is make sure that we get equal pay. There was a survey done, and nearly 75% of African Americans support reparations for slavery, while only 15% of white Americans do. So that's what we're up against, okay? As far as the question on Christians, the Jesuit leader at Georgetown said of the slave cell, or the cell of African people changing narratives, we betrayed the very name of Jesus. Okay, and Jesus is in Jesuit, and they sold to people. As far as youth are concerned, pick what you want, and then agitate, educate, and organize. And the last thing is when it comes to the cannabis industry, what we have to remember is that hemp, as Senator Toy Hutchison told us, is cannabis's sober cousin, and hemp is rope, fabric, food, etc. Okay, so you have an industry. Now we can wait around for this 15% of people to decide that they're going to give us reparations, or we can get into something right now, make sure there is social equity as we get into it. Me and Esther were talking about the land in Colombia owned by African descended people who can farm this. We have to get into this industry while it's not really in its infancy. If $10 billion has been invested in it in 1 year, it's not in its infancy, but it also doesn't have us in it. So we have to make sure we get into it. And you can not get into the cannabis side if you're not into that. Get into the hemp side, okay? Cotton, hemp, right? So let's do what we can right now.
All right, thank you. Let's give a round of applause to the panel. Went way over, so we're going to go straight into our next panel, I believe. So, Salima, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to again thank all of the panelists. That was a very robust conversation, and we could tell by all of the engagement here that, you know, this was a really important conversation that a lot of people wanted to have. So we obviously allowed it to go over because we wanted to make sure that everyone was heard. So thank you. And so our next step is actually to go into some facilitated discussions around concrete next steps for the decade. We were going to have separate conversations, but what we've decided to do is actually combine them in the interest of time. So what I'm going to do is actually ask the facilitators of the next session to come up, including Carrie McLean, who's a human rights attorney, is with the Center for Pan-African Affairs and also the National Lawyers Guild. And then I'm going to invite you all to exit whenever you're ready.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. Thanks again. And then also, Ade Oliaye, who's with ENAR Steering Group Against Afrophobia. Can you please come up? And then Isabel Mamadou, who is a UN PAD Fellow and IDPAD Implementation Team in Spain. So if the three of you can come up. What we're going to actually have you do, I understand that you were going to facilitate these conversations. Maybe what you can do is briefly speak about what you would like folks to do in the groups. We're going to separate everyone into two groups, and then we're going to have them workshop in those groups. At the end of this workshopping session, we'll come back and do a report out on what each group discussed. So Carrie is going to lead a discussion around the UN Permanent Forum that we just talked about. And then Ade is going to lead a discussion on the UN Declaration on the Rights of People of African Descent. And then Isabel will lead a discussion on the National Plans of Action. So I'll let you guys take it away. Okay. This entire session should end at 5:15.
But are we going to divide them then after
we are. Yes, after you give your statements, you're going to divide people into two groups. We're actually going to ask everyone to come up and get into two groups here because we have the flip charts here where we can workshop. But first, I want you guys to be able to explain what it is you would like to do with the groups. Thank you. And I'll stay here in case you have questions.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie McLean. I'm going to begin by just reading you some language from the UN concerning the Permanent Forum. The UN General Assembly in its resolutions has said that the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent will serve as a consultation mechanism for people of African descent and other interested stakeholders, as a platform for improving the quality of life and livelihoods of people of African descent. and that the Permanent Forum will contribute to elaborating a United Nations declaration, which is the first step towards a legally binding instrument on the promotion and full respect of human rights of people of African descent. So that's the language that's come out of some UN resolutions. So the UN has discussed the Permanent Forum amongst its member states several times and has actually reached out to civil society for input on a couple of occasions. There was a call for civil society input on the Permanent Forum in 2015 that I participated in. And then, of course, earlier this year, there was a consultation in Geneva in May that I think maybe some people in this room participated in as well. So the UN is actually set to make some decisions concerning the Permanent Forum later this month. Our time is limited, so we're going to try to use it effectively, just try to make the most of it. We're going to divide you guys into two groups, like Salima said, one on each side of the room, so that you have a little bit of privacy. And you're going to discuss the Permanent Forum, the declaration, and the national plans of action, which my colleagues will talk about. Regarding the Permanent Forum, you'll spend about, well, for all of the conversation, actually, you're going to have 30 minutes. For the Permanent Forum, you're going to consider 3 questions. Number 1, should the Permanent Forum be established under ECOSOC or under the Human Rights Council, and explain why? Number 2, concerning the structure, inside your packets, there's a civil society proposal that was signed by over 100 organizations on the modalities of the Permanent Forum. It's in your packet, so you can take a look at it, and if there is anything that you want to add or critique, you can discuss that in your group as well. And number 3, the UN is set to make some decisions regarding the Permanent Forum later this month. So what can we do between now and then to get the outcome that we want? And what advocacy should we do after that meeting? Thanks.
Thank you. So following on from your work on the Permanent Forum, we'd like you to have a look at the draft declaration in your package and consider goals, strategies, and tactics to ensure that the mechanism, that the declaration works for us. So there are 3 things we want you to consider. Are there things that we need to add to the draft? How do we make it a reality? And what are the tactics that we can employ to ensure state parties adopt the UN draft declaration that's in your packet? As you've heard earlier, we've had a resolution, which I was a part of as well, passed in Europe, and the big thing is that it doesn't have the teeth. It's not legally binding, and also state parties aren't sort of playing their role. And even with the DDPA, there has been, state parties have been, and with IDPAD, state parties are not playing their role as they should. So that's key to try and get state parties to play their role in implementing the draft declaration, which is in your package. And also, if you've got anything to add, please do. Thanks.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to introduce myself first. My name is Isabel. I'm a human rights professional based in Spain, and I am actually working for a Spanish NGO that provides protection and assistance to migrants and refugees. And I have also participated in the UN Fellowship Program for people of African descent. And for the last 2 years, I've been coordinating actions to implement the decade in Spain. And in the framework of this decade, I have coordinated the first visit of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent in Spain. And after the final report of the visit and the conclusions were published, I started contacting and lobbying national government, local governments, and ministers and other political actors to show them how the decade could connect with their policies. And finally, I have recently been contacted by the Prime Minister of Spain and his team to start conversation on a plan to implement the decade. So this is the point where we are in Spain, and I would like to share with you some of the basic steps to reach this point. So my workshop will be divided in 3 parts. In the first part, we will see what are the key elements, I mean the resources, tools, and skills we need to push the decade to official recognition of our governments. Then in the second part, we will see the content of a plan of action, a national plan of action. I mean, what issues need to be addressed, who is involved, and for what. And my co-fellow, Melissa Boswick, who's been involved in the drafting of the National Plan of Guyana, will share her experience, and she will talk about the challenges once the plan is already implemented. And at the end, if we have some time, we could have a debate with some recommendations, and you will be able to ask questions.
Okay,
That's
great.
it.
Thank you. So if folks can come up and actually just divide into 2 groups up here, I think that would be the thing that makes the most sense, because we have, I see a flip chart here, and one's being brought here. And then I don't know if you all want to come down.
got a question.
And actually facilitate those
Yeah, sure.
and go back and forth. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, what about the translation?
So
Right.
I'm not, one of the things I was thinking is we could take one of the microphones, but it would just be for one group at a time, because I don't know how we would do that. We weren't planning on doing this simultaneously, but because of time and because the translators are actually going to be leaving, I'm not sure. Yeah. I welcome any recommendations from you, Justin.
You know, Salima,
Yeah.
if someone in each group just tries to help with translation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if folks from each group would be willing to translate for their colleagues. I know that could present some burden and makes it difficult for you to participate yourself, but we're wondering if that would be an option as well too. But in the meantime, I think just because in terms of time, we should just have people get into.
Yes.
So if people could get into groups,
Yeah.
So how do you divide the groups?
2
It's
groups.
up to you guys.
Yeah, just
Okay.
2 groups.
So maybe
just
the folks
separate.
who are on this side of the room, if you can come up and over here so you can engage in a discussion, that would be great. Each group is actually going to be talking about the same thing. We were just trying to put them in smaller groups so that there could be a more robust discussion.
Yes.
But we need people to get up and move over. Yes. So we can do that once you guys are in the small groups. Yeah. Thank you. I think you guys should come down.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys.
If we can stick together, then everybody can discuss it, and we have translators too.
Okay.
Yeah. I think you should start first with it. I know, but no. If 1, 2, 3, yeah. Fine. Okay.
Yeah, because I need to tell them what we decided because I want them to sign on to it. Yeah.
Oh, so you want me to start now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Is it gone?
Oh, where to start talking? Right. Are you ready?
Okay.
Carrie, you can go ahead and go first.
All right, I'll just tell you the decisions that we arrived at in our session on the permanent forum. After some vigorous conversation, we decided that we take two actions. One was to draft a short statement on behalf of people at this conference that would like to see the permanent forum under ECOSOC. And people can sign on to that short statement. You know, if you don't want to sign on to it, you don't have to. But if you'd like to, then let us know. The other action is to have a separate statement that's going to be circulated, I think, today to our email list for the international network that's working on the international decade. And the request will be for people to sign on to the statement by Friday. And if they don't sign on to it, then the statement will just go out without their input. So if you're not on that mailing list, you need to let Salima or
Sakira Cook know that, and she will add you to the mailing list. It's the International Network of People of African Descent mailing list, and that's where a lot of these conversations are taking place.
Yes, so, and you know what, so are we going to send both statements to that list, or just deal with, I think it's going to be confusing.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's going to be confusing. So basically,
One statement.
basically, if there's going to be, there's going to be one statement sent to the international list, and that's going to be just a general statement of organizations that support ECOSOC, and then there's a statement that's concerning the participants of this meeting. And I guess if you want to sign on to that, I'd suggest you speak with Esther and Mireille about that. Is that fine?
Yes. It's just one
but
statement is the same.
Mireille proposed two, I'm telling you that. Okay.
Yeah,
All
it's
right.
going to be one
So
statement.
just the one statement.
So do folks, so I know that there were folks, I understand that we're short on time, but there are also folks who couldn't participate in a conversation because of time, and they are part of other conversations. So do you have any very brief, hopefully questions about what we said in terms of next steps?
Any questions about signing on? Joining the email list? No?
Yeah, so you can reach out to Sakira Cook if you are not receiving those emails and want to be added to the list. So I think that's it for the permanent forum. Yay, okay. Moving on. Ade, you were talking about the UN Declaration for People of African Descent.
Yeah, Ade, so speaking. So basically, in terms of the UN Declaration, we had everybody have a look at their the declaration in their pack, and we decided that the draft declaration should be revisited or revised ASAP. Secondly, in relation to that, the AU Agenda 2063 needs to be included, and in addition, there is no reference to the DDPA in Article 1.1. On the other hand, some organizations had problems with Article 2.2 and 2.3 being in the draft, and they felt that this needs to be removed because they relate to states and not to people. Thirdly, more importantly, equally importantly, it was a strategy that we're going to employ to make sure that the UN, that the first and foremost, that the declaration becomes a reality. And to do that, it was felt that the permanent forum must be in place under the right structure and ASAP as soon as possible. And as a part of that process, it was felt that organizations from all over the world should endorse should endorse the declaration, and a broader coalition should be built across continents to make impact. Thank you.
Great. Any comments on
Any
that?
comments?
I understand it was a longer, all of these were much longer conversations, and we would have liked to been able to get into it a little bit more, but
Anything not clear? Yeah.
yes.
Just a question, will we be able to get an electronic copy of this for easier dissemination?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
When it gets recirculated?
Absolutely. We will be. Yes, we can absolutely do that. Yes. Just make sure you give Sakira your contact information so you email her. Email Sakira, and she'll make sure that you're added to the list. Okay, great. Isabel, do you want to follow up?
Yes, for the workshop on national action plans, we just have time to do the first part. And I've been asking to the participants what key elements we need to push the decade to official recognition of our governments. So I've been listening to the contributions of all of them. We talk about human rights, resources, sorry. We need human resources, we need a team to identify community leaders, to mobilize and to encourage and stimulate the participation of people of African descent in the social and political life of the countries. We also need human rights knowledge because we cannot fight for the rights of people of African descent if we don't know their fundamental rights and freedom. So we need to know the mechanisms and tools at national and international level to face racial discrimination. And then we have to provide them with those tools and mechanisms. And we've been talking about designing a strategy. I mean, it is important to establish conversation and dialogue with the government, but at the same time, we have to design and define coordinated actions to put pressure on the governments. And those actions could be like in Belgium, one colleague said, campaigns. We can use also demonstrations. We can use the media. We can send communications to the human rights procedures, to the special UN special procedures. We can use the access to justice to bring the situation to international justice. And then we've been also talking about funds, okay? Funds is an issue because we need funds for almost everything. So we need funds to organize events like this one. We need funds to cover the costs of travels and hotels when we have meetings with political actors or other civil society organizations. And we need funds for almost everything. So the colleague from Canada, is it, was asking how to get those funds. So from my experience, the funds I got are all from public institutions. So I got funds from local governments, from the city council of my city in Valencia, and I also got funds from the UN, from the OHCHR, but I don't know how to have private funds. So I don't know if someone in the room has an experience to share about how we can get funds to push for the decade.
Thank you. Anyone want to respond to that question in general? I mean, specifically
Yes,
about
there
funds
is
or in general? Okay, Marian?
Can you?
Because there's other
So for folks who couldn't hear, that was Marian Douglas Ungaro who mentioned crowdfunding, and you said Patreon? Patreon. It would be a recommendation. Anyone else have recommendations specifically or generally about what Isabel said about what they've come up with?
Just briefly, I am aware of organizations of civil society in Bristol who are working in collaboration with private companies, mostly in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are much more popular. But I know one or two are approaching private sector organizations around IDPAD as well. So it may be something that you might want to explore, working in collaboration with private sector organizations.
Okay.
Okay, we have one more comment here. Yeah.
Hi, hola.
And when we're talking about when we're receiving funds from private entities, there are a lot of foundations that seek sometimes to have tax write-offs, and so they seek to finance organizations or social projects. So we have to be aware of those in that sense, and also offer these organizations or foundations something in exchange, because at the end of the day, these are companies that want to see some also benefits, and so there have been some organizations, so they have given benefits to their employees, and so this has been a strategy that has been used by some organizations, and that has worked out very well. On the other hand, I wanted to ask the three of you, or perhaps everyone in the room, a question in general. My experience with the decade, there has been times when I have found more obstacles within the community itself about sharing and disseminating information for strategies of communication or organizing, rather than the limitations that we are facing with institutions or the government. So since this issue has not been talked about yet, I want to talk about it, if it has been in your experience as well, about how we can overcome these challenges, that sometimes there is some pressures within our own community as to the decade, because I think one of the motivations is the lack of trust within the decade itself, which seems like that is a faraway monster, and a lot of people don't know what it's about, and perhaps there's some sort of resistance within the same community, and I would like to know what is your opinion as to this. Thank you.
Does anyone want to comment on that? I think it was a question for the...
Yes, it was a question. Do we have to answer?
You can just
answer?
respond. Yeah,
Okay.
you can just respond.
I will respond in.
And then we have one more question.
In Spanish. Sí, bueno, efectivamente.
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, we work in the same team, and so the limitations that you are talking about or feeling is the same that I have sensed. And so I think on one hand is a lack of information that is being produced about and producing this fear and how the decade can help and what it can bring to us. But on the other hand, I think that is the colonial heritage that we have, the way in which this has been worked, this sort of competitiveness that we have. And we're not seeking a shared objective or a main goal. We're competing perhaps for the same resources, asking for the same money, the same financial backing, the same subsidies. So perhaps we're competing for visibility. There could be a lot of other things, but I think there's an issue of competing against each other, but also a lack of trust that comes from the lack of information from a general picture of what the decade is about. Through how can we combat this? Through dialogue, through conversation, that's very important. And perhaps through, well, someone has to give, right? We always have, someone has to step up when there's some sort of conflict, when there's a misunderstanding. One of the parties has to take that first step and share that information. In our case, promoting the decade, perhaps we are the ones who have to step up and approach the organizations in civil society to explain what the decade is about, what is the goal, and to be able to include all the organizations so that we can implement the decade.
I think it's okay because of time. We're just going to take one more question and then close it out.
Okay, I have a question. I just wanted to give a bit of context about why in our group we are proposing a letter on the Permanent Forum, because perhaps people that weren't in the group might not have that context. Towards the end of the month, the General Assembly is going to vote on the creation of the Permanent Forum. When we went to the consultation in May in Geneva on the Permanent Forum, as a group of organizations, 118 organizations signed the document that I think you guys have in your packs on our vision for the decade, for the Permanent Forum. But many of us at that time didn't have a clarity or a clear position on whether we thought the Permanent Forum should be under ECOSOC or under the Human Rights Council. So the document doesn't mention that element, which is really the most fundamental element in terms of how the Permanent Forum will look and how it will be able to work and run and how much resources it will have and who will be part of it and everything else. So since May, a group of us began to study the issue and to look at the structure of the UN and came up with our position, which is that it should be under ECOSOC. Now we've spoken to several states about that. Several states have also supported that position. But what we know is that the resolution will be voted on at the end of this month, and we want to make sure that if the we haven't seen the resolution, we don't know what it says, but we want to make sure that if the resolution pushes for a Permanent Forum under Human Rights Council, that it doesn't pass. And we want to make sure that states can have an alternative vision for the Permanent Forum and make sure that Permanent Forum is under ECOSOC, to make sure that it has teeth, to make sure it has decision-making power, to make sure it can have a direct route to the UNG and the Security Council. So that's why we're proposing that letter. We have a short position statement that we will share with the rest of the network, and everyone who's on the email list or wants to be on the email list will receive that, and then we'll also draft this letter, and anyone that wants to sign up can sign up, but it's a short time. So we're asking for signatures by Friday because, as I said, the voting is within a week, and we need to make sure that states get that information before.
Thank you. And then I think I'm going to call Justin and Sakira up so that we can close out. And Melissa, can you come up too?
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for that report back. And thanks for all of you who participated in that conversation. So we're going to ask Melissa, our colleague that works with MyPad in Momentum Education, to just note something that was in your packets. It's a flyer that's in the packet, and she's going to give a little bit of an explanation about that because it's a great opportunity for each of you. So, Melissa?
All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening, or afternoon, rather. So in your packets, you all have a flyer. It's a scholarship to one of our workshops. And so I work with Momentum Education. I'm the Director of Professional Development. And at Momentum, we offer personal and professional development trainings and workshops to really support you in the work that you are doing to refill your cup in this work of advocacy. And so what we would like to offer to you all as a part of being here as an attendee is a $498 scholarship to attend our personal development training free of charge. And so on this form, you'll see the upcoming dates for the workshop on the back. We offer our trainings in New York City twice a month, every month, and we also offer it quarterly here in DC. So the next upcoming training in DC is January 23rd. But to take advantage of this scholarship is really a gift to you, like I said, for the work that you do, and it's an opportunity to pour back into yourself for your own personal development, to recharge those batteries. And so thank you. And also, if you're interested in taking advantage of these scholarship, you can sign up online using this code here, IDPAD 2019, or you can personally connect with me. We also work with organizations to build, and we work in schools as well, to really support in building team and community and social emotional development movement and working on like human connection. And so if you're interested in that work for your own organizations, I'd be happy to connect with you. But please take advantage of this scholarship, and thank you for all that you do. This is our gift to you, so thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right, thanks to all of you, again, for all of your time today, for the important conversation. This was a labor of love for all three of us to put together. But all of you who tuned in online and everyone who was in the room, honestly, really we thought it was important to have all of your voices part of the discussion. And we will be preparing for you an after-conference report that really documents what has happened, what the challenges have been, and charts the future that all of you talked about forward for all of us. And we'll share that with everyone for your feedback and input on before it becomes public. So again, thanks to all of you. And we're gonna take a big group picture right here in the front. And so please come up to the stage and join us for this photo, this historic opportunity, historic moment, I should say, and opportunity. So thank you again.
It's great. Woo!
Yeah.
Woo! Woo, for all this man. It looks gonna be good. We have some good stuff came out of this.
Yeah. And the video is gonna be amazing.
Video's gonna be great, because
We have this video.
forever.
Yes.
And I know we go to the decade report. I thought this was
No, we.
yeah. So that on like Black America and how we are going decade.
The US.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you gotta email me.
It happens.
Email me. I said, write it down. Here, let me write it down.
Follow for this. For this squad. Okay. The books.
Melissa, thank you so much.
I have some chef. But